Southerners originate from Florida. And our first paper is by Mihai, Bijacu, close, who is originally from Romania and now pastors in Florida. He is both a Romanian and a multicultural. There's the word I was looking for. Church. Mainly Caribbean. Okay, that's interesting. He's also a PhD student at Andrews, where he's studying under Mark Buchanan, and he's in the writing phase of his PhD, and his topic is 7-day ecosphere creation, a response to Denny Lamoureux's evolutionary creation model. His paper today is titled From Out of Date to Up to Date. He'll have 20 minutes, and then we'll have Tammy present, and we'll do questions at the end for both of them. So,
thank you very much. My name is Mihai, Bijacu. Thank you. We're very close. And the title of my paper is Revelation 13, From Out of Date to Up to Date. Introduction. The pandemic, the war of aggression in Ukraine, and the climate crisis, seen as fulfillments of Matthew 24, have once again spurred fervent talk about the time of the end in Adventism. These discussions, in line with traditional Adventist eschatology, center, of course, around the Catholic Church persecuting the people of God at the time of the end. In recent years, however, traditional Adventist eschatology has been also challenged internally, as opposed to the mainly external challenges so far. Many Adventist authors now view it as a product of 19th century anti-Catholic sentiments in the United States. For example, Admiral Nkube writes that, quote, much of the conditions that prevailed in the late 1800s that made Sunday laws plausible are no longer evident in our time, end quote. The Western secularized society in which we live right now, which is totally different than the time when Adventist eschatology was put together in the 19th century, prompts said authors to call for a, quote, recontextualizations and a review of the assumptions behind our understanding of Revelation 13, end quote, same Admiral Nkube. The purpose of this paper, thus, is to re-examine Revelation 13 in order to show how the time of the end will be completely different from both 19th century USA and the contemporary context through at least one crucial element, the introduction of the worldwide pervasive supernatural. Then I will construct the timeline of events for the time of the end based on Revelation 13, encouraging readers to find the historical identification of the main actors. The last part of the paper will provide guidance to pastorally address problematic and psychologically damaging eschatological anxieties. In terms of methodology, this paper already presupposes that Revelation 13 is inspired by God to show to his church the things that are going to happen at the end of time, and that the best way to understand Revelation is within the historicist system of interpretation. What is under discussion, however, is the way we interpret Revelation 13, and if its traditional understanding in Adventism is still plausible, given the challenges that have been brought forward lately. To do so, in my reading of Revelation 13, I will not start with the traditional understanding or with what Ellen White has to say. The direction of movement will be from the text of Revelation 13 towards historical understanding, and not the other way around, with the endeavor to find the core elements of Revelation 13 that could be acceptable to both sides of the matter. Traditional Adventist eschatology challenged. As mentioned in the beginning, the rapid events of the past 4 years have again brought to the forefront of contemporary theological concern a renewed interest in eschatology. With the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, the lockdown, and the subsequent mandate to close churches has been seen as an infringement on religious liberties and as a persecution of the people of God, not unlike end-of-time level persecutions. in many circles outside Adventism, and by an interesting theological contamination in Adventism too, vaccines have been seen as the mark of the beast, or at least a precursory or a trial run to the final persecution through the mark of the beast. This discussion gained even more track with Russia attacking Ukraine in early 2022. Many feared a world war would break out again, and in some Adventist circles, the role of the United States in this conflict has been widely discussed as a fulfillment of traditional Adventist understanding of USA as the earth beast in Revelation 13. See, for example, Martin Walter's presentation on the topic. For example, Walter Martin. For example, Russia versus Ukraine, king of the north versus king of the south, which at this point has almost 200,000 views on YouTube. And he has a whole series about that. So that's pretty popular in Adventist. And the last straw was when Pope Francis has repeatedly called world leaders to come to an agreement regarding a solution to climate change, all in the context of the 2015 Laudato Si encyclical and the call for offering rest to an overexerted world. The common denominator in these discussions is the role that the papacy will play in persecuting the people of God by imposing a mandatory Sunday worship over the whole world. All the events mentioned above are seen as fulfillment of the biblical prophecy and are as proof that our traditional eschatology is correct. It is this very core of our interpretation of the time of the end that has come under heavy scrutiny lately. Several Adventist authors have pointed out that our eschatological understanding is due more to cultural elements at the time of its inception and to the interpretation of Ellen White rather than to biblical exegesis. Lawrence Siebold, for example, he writes that, quote, all the conspiratorial notions that have accreted to our eschatology, very little can be defended from Scripture without heavy interpretation from Uriah Smith and Ellen White, unquote. Wagner Brunsma concurs and states that, quote, we should realize that this Sunday law scenario is mainly based on the interpretation of the prophecies of the Revelation by Ellen White in her book, The Great Controversy, end quote. He further adds that, quote, Ellen White wrote her book, The Great Controversy, in the late 19th century against the background of circumstances that prevailed in the United States. Her world was divided between Roman Catholics and Protestants. She belonged to a tiny Adventist sect that was not welcome. She lived in a time when politicians at the state level and the national level were doing all they could to enforce Sunday observance. She experienced how in some states, Sabbath keepers were actually put in prison, end quote. The punchline of all of this is, in Brunsma's words, her world no longer exists. That is at least correct. Ellen White's world is not the world that we live in today. In Matthew Cordy's words, quote, things have changed. Current geopolitical and / theological calculus is dramatically different from the late 19th century. Ours is a different world now. And going forward, I find it difficult to imagine Muslims and practicing Jews, for example, voluntarily acquiescing to the enforceable universal Sunday worship arrangement that has the Catholic Pope in charge and every group worshiping on Sunday, end quote. And to make matters even worse, Sunday worship doesn't have the same ring in the West as it did in the past, with very few people regarding it as a little more than a day for secular rest and pleasure. To sum up, traditional Adventist eschatology is said to have been conceived in a world of opposition to Catholicism, a world that doesn't exist today anymore. A, quote, world that suggests that Sunday laws likely may not ever be enacted, at least not in our lifetimes, and maybe never, end quote, Matthew 40. Revelation 13 brought up to date a whole new world. It is absolutely true that the world in which Ellen White wrote The Great Controversy does not exist anymore. And it is also true that the world that we live in today, with greater than ever religious liberties in the West and sheer opposition to Christianity in many Middle Eastern and Asian countries, would make it almost impossible for such a worldwide enforcement of Sunday worship that we profess in our interpretation of Revelation 13 to ever come to happen. The problem with these statements, however, is that they assume that the world of Revelation 13 is the world in which we live in today. I suggest there is an insufficiently explored element in Revelation 13 that will help us understand that the world in which these Sunday laws are supposed to happen will be a completely different world from both Ellen G. White's world and our contemporary world. Revelation 13 presents the activity of two very separate beasts, the sea beast and the earth beast, and also a later third actor that we will explore in the next section. And these beasts work together to deceive the whole world and to persecute the saints. Verse 7. The earth beast does everything to point the attention towards the sea beast and forces the whole earth to worship the sea beast. The way in which the whole earth is deceived is by the signs that this beast is able to perform. One such sign is mentioned specifically. And it is this sign that will help us understand the very special historical context at the time of the end. One that I suggest could have the potential to make Adventist traditional eschatology at least plausible, if not even probable. This particular sign that the earth beast performs is bringing fire down from heaven. Now, where there are several instances in the Old Testament where fire comes down from heaven, one of these events stands out in its resemblance to Revelation 13. And there's a strong possibility that John was referencing it in his description of the time of the end. On Mount Carmel, Elijah brought fire down from heaven before the people of Israel gathered there to decide which power to worship, Baal or Yahweh. The story is well known. A test was established, and whichever God through his representatives was able to pass the test, then that God would have become the true God of worship. In spite of all their collective efforts, the 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah were not able to bring fire down from heaven to burn the sacrifice, and thus failed to prove that Baal was the true God. When the time came for Elijah to prove Yahweh's power, he made sure that if he was to perform the miracle and bring fire down from heaven, no one would have ever doubted the miracle, being tempted to think that some kind of deceit was involved. Elijah commanded the people to dig a trench around the altar and to pour water on the sacrifice until the trench was filled with water. Now, nothing short of a miracle could have set the whole thing on fire. And now, when Yahweh did indeed bring fire down from heaven, it wasn't only the sacrifice that was burned. The wood, the stone, and the water and the trench were all consumed by fire, proving once and for all that Yahweh was the true God to be worshipped. And it is in these terms that of Elijah's miracle that John describes the situation at the time of the end. God will require his people to worship him, but God's enemy, the dragon, and his unholy trinity with the sea beast and the earth beast, will challenge God's worship and claim it for his own. However, in stark contrast to Elijah's experience, this time, God will not prevent the unholy trinity from performing miracles as he did with the prophets of Baal. This time, the false system of worship will be able to produce miracles on a worldwide scale, miracles that will deceive the whole world into believing that the false system of worship is actually the one that God himself ordained. Many scholars, like John Pauline and Ranko Stefanovic, have suggested that John is alluding to another important instance of fire descending from heaven, one to which John himself has taken part that will further add to this argument. It is pointed to the Pentecost as being referenced here too, which would seem to suggest that at the end of time, there will be a worldwide religious revival, not unlike the one experienced by the disciples after they received the Holy Spirit. This, however, will be a false religious revival, as it is brought about by Satan's coalition. In light of these things, I suggest that we can safely assume that the world of Revelation 13 will be a world completely different from the one we live in right now. At this moment, we live in a world in which liberties are valued and in which faith in God is relegated to the personal domain of life. A world, at least in the West, in which the default position to all things religious is one of tolerance, with some believing and others not, and everyone getting along with everyone. The level of religious persecutions envisioned by traditional Adventist eschatology is not possible in the world we live right now. However, the world of Revelation 13 is another kind of world. There will be a world in which doubt about the existence of God will be completely removed. A world in which the supernatural will pervade the natural, and in which worship will be the normal reaction of a world seduced by newly performed miracles. It will be a world in which unbelief cannot find support, and in which religion will once again be brought to the forefront of public life. Revelation 13 and the coalition of evil. Having established that Revelation 13 presents a world that is completely different from our own, one in which miracles will be performed by the enemies of God to deceive the whole world into the false system of worship, we can now construct a general guideline of the main characters and of their actions in Revelation 13. This guideline will help the reader make a more precise historical application of the biblical message about the time of the end. Revelation 13 starts with introducing the first of Satan's allies for the time of the end, the sea beast. This sea beast is described in terms of the kingdoms mentioned in Daniel 7. 7 heads and 10 horns, leopard, bear and lion. It has crown on its horns. It also has a great authority which it receives from the dragon. Verse 2. These elements seem to point to this beast being composed of all these empires that have opposed God's people in the past. But this beast also has strong religious traits as it continuously blasphemes God's name and his dwelling place. It makes war with the saints. It is worshipped. And it is referred by the people of earth as who is like the beast, in a way reminiscent of Michael's name, who is like God. Thus, the first actor at the time of the end seems to be a political religious power with deep roots in some of the most important enemies of the people of God throughout history, enemies that have at one point ruled the whole world, quote unquote. It was the whole world that was relevant to the people of God. At one point it was the Levant, then the Mediterranean basin, and then it kept expanding. We're also let know that at one point, presumably towards the end, this beast will receive a serious blow, rendering as dead for a while. But ultimately, he will have his power resumed, and as a result, the whole world will follow the beast. Verse 3. The second actor on the scene is a completely different beast. One that uses no element of previous beasts, but that has two important characteristics. It has two horns, like that of a lamb, but speaks like a dragon. This would seem to point that this is a new power that doesn't have any connection to the previous power, that stems from an element, earth, directly opposite to the medium of the first beast, water. It will also seem to be a power that claims to have the authority of Christ, which is the only Lamb of the book of Revelation, but that, when it shows its true identity, it is revealed to be like Satan, who is the only dragon in the book of Revelation. It is this power that, acting like a false Elijah-type prophet, will perform the miracles that will bring about a false worldwide religious revival that will transform the world into a fully religious world. It is this power that convinces the whole world to create a third actor, a third power, an image of the beast, that is a power that resembles what the first beast was, namely, a political religious entity that ruled the whole world. In a gesture meant again to mimic the actions of God, the earth power, beast power gives life to the third entity. And as this third actor starts to function, it immediately imposes a worship system and persecutes all those that do not adhere to this worship system, and receiving the mark of having adhered to this system. And receive the mark. Having stripped the core teaching of Revelation 13 of their historical application that we have ascribed to them, I can only hope that readers will take these elements and try to see what historical realities fit better. But no matter what the interpretation is, I believe it has now become apparent that even if this terrible scenario is not possible in the world we live in today, it becomes very much so once we understand that this world will become a religious dystopia replete with supernatural elements. Pastoral concerns for preaching about the time of the end, and we will end the paper. The reality of the gruesomeness of the time of the end presented in Revelation 13 cannot be escaped. This is what the inspiration of God has revealed to us that will happen at the time of the end. Unfortunately, our church has not done a very good job preaching about this topic. Most of our expositions of Revelation have been focused on the beasts and their action, on the persecution of the people of God, on the mark of the beast, and all the terrible things presented in the book of Revelation. This has instilled fear into the souls of many in our church, especially young people. I myself have experienced this growing up in the church. Both in the local church and in my family, I have been taught that the people of God will suffer persecutions and torture, that will be attacked by the power of the beast. I grew up fearing that time of the end when some of us will even be killed because of these powers, because we will have to choose to follow God instead of a false system of worship. It is time that our church seriously reevaluates the focus of our presentations of Revelation. Unfortunately, we have missed that the book of Revelation itself never places the emphasis on the persecution, but rather on the deliverance from persecution. Revelation 13 provides the perfect example because Revelation 13 is not the end of the story. Immediately after mentioning the mark of the beast, the scene changes and John sees the 144,000, those that will follow the Lamb wherever he goes, 14 verse 4, and who are later described as those that, quote, who had been victorious over the beast and its image and over the number of its name, 15 verse 2. This pattern is present throughout the book of Revelation. Whenever the situation becomes so dire and the risk of provoking the anguish of the audience becomes too big, the scene changes, and God brings the resolution to the presented problem. For example, chapter 6 presents the terrible things that would happen as a result of breaking the seals, and it ends with the question, who could stand before the wrath of God and the Lamb? Immediately, the scene changes, and John sees those that are able to stand. The 144,000, the great multitude, thus reassuring the audience that those that are faithful will be able to stand before God. We can never escape the reality of the terrible times ahead, but we can focus on the deliverance of God, that God will provide his people from these times of trouble. Just like Jesus told his disciples, I have told you these things so that you may have peace. In this world, you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world. John 16, verse 33. Last paragraph, conclusions. While the statement that our traditional eschatology is very unlikely in the world we live in today, Revelation 13 shows us that the world at the time of the end will be a completely different world. Miracles will be performed that will eliminate any need for secularism and that will bring about a religious dystopia in which the current and future political, religious, worldwide actors will be free to impose persecutions to their detractors. If these persecutions will take the form of imposing a Sunday worship, still requires further interpretation of the biblical text. But I suggest that we can selfly state one needs not a priori eliminate the possibility that traditional Adventist eschatology is a very plausible scenario for the time of the end. However, what most certainly requires re-examination is the way in which we preach about the time of the end. It is imperative that we switch the focus from the doom and gloom of the biblical prophecy to the deliverance that God will provide to his people.